And I just want to put a thanks out there to Jennifer Van Gennep, who's our communications strategist and who is the Wizard of Oz behind the scenes here today. All right, so Jack Gibbons and David Donnelly and I worked together on a number of really important campaigns, most recently reforming the Municipal Elections Act in order to prohibit contributions to municipal election campaigns from corporations and unions. And that was really driven by an observation and a pretty detailed study into the relationship between corporate and particularly development contributions to municipal election campaign financing and outcomes in terms of development at the municipal level. And from this work, we do know that there is a link between local councils and the development community. It does make it hard to trust that council always has the town and its residents and the environment at their best interests at heart. Even with significant policy wins like the Lake Simcoe Protection Act and anti-SLAPP legislation, the Greenbelt and the Oak Ridges Marine legislation, which David was involved in, all of development battles do still occur on the municipal level. Increasingly, it falls to citizens to defend nature. So responding to this, the Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition looked at how well protected land is by policy. I'm going to show you our short 3-minute video about that, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers, and our first speaker will be David Donnelly. So video, and I'm going to share my screen here in just a minute.
Oh, forests. What's not to love? They give us so many free ecosystem services like clean air, filtered water, stormwater storage, the tweeting of birds, and erosion control. Forests house insects and animals, store carbon, and shade our shorelines and homes. We just can't live without them, and we wouldn't want to. But have you ever noticed that a beautiful forest is there one day and then suddenly the bulldozers and saws move in? Members of the Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition saw so much of that happening in Innisfil that we wondered how well protected our forests and wetlands really are. So we analyzed the policies that protect our forests and wetlands, also known as natural features, and found that only some policies truly restrict development and other land use changes. Digging deeper, we worked with professional cartographers who found that only 21% of the Lake Simcoe watershed's landscape is covered by policies that strongly protect natural features. These are the green areas in this map. The strength of these policies is determined by the Government of Ontario. The yellow parts of the map are protected too, but they are subject to a death by 1,000 cuts. This is because protections are weak and also not permanent. Particularly in northern, rural, and well-forested parts of the watershed, permissions are often granted to alter the land use, cut down trees to build on a property, or subdivide properties. The Lake Simcoe Protection Plan includes a science-based target of 40% high-quality natural cover in the watershed. Today, 28% of the watershed is considered high-quality natural cover, but only half of that land is protected by strong policies. The ecosystem services provided by the amazing, beautiful natural areas in the Lake Simcoe watershed are valued at $922 million a year. Protecting nature makes sense economically and environmentally. We think it's time to get this right. We need strong policy protection for at least 40% of the watershed's land, and we're not there yet. The Lake Simcoe Protection Plan review this fall gives us an opportunity to solve this problem. So let's do it right now. Stronger policies for natural areas today supports clean, safe water and beaches for future generations. Join us in asking the province to achieve the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan's high-quality natural cover target. Learn more about our research and our Protect Our Plan campaign at rescuelakesimcoe.org.
All right, so this is really just a wrap up of the research that the Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition did this year on how well protected our Greenlands are. And so it's on our website under accomplishments under the Greenlands project. And in short, between 12 and 14 or 14 and 21% of the of Simcoe County and of the Lake Simcoe watershed respectively are really well protected by policy. So that leaves a huge area that is somewhat protected by policy, but not very strongly, like they're not provincially significant wetlands, for example. So we are concerned about those areas where we don't have really strong policy protections, and that's a lot of what we experience when we're looking at development battles. Those are often occurring in those areas. So I'm not going to spend more time on the video because I want to make sure we have the time what we promised for this webinar. So I'm going to introduce David. I encourage you to go back to our website and look at it under the Lake Simcoe Greenlands project. David Donnelly is going to be our first speaker. So David is one of Canada's leading environmental lawyers and an award-winning advocate for smart growth. He has represented public interest groups and ratepayers in some of Ontario's key environmental battles, including Oak Ridges Moraine in Richmond Hill, Big Bay Point at Lake Simcoe, OMB hearing, Nelson Aggregates Joint Board hearing, and the Walkerton Commission inquiry. David is a founding member of some of Ontario's most important environmental campaigns, including the Lake Simcoe Protection Act, Greenbelt, Green Energy Act, anti-SLAPP legislation, and smart growth building standards. He goes to court regularly to protect green space, Aboriginal culture, and heritage, and to prosecute environmental offenses. And now we're going to turn it over to David to share some insights, and I'll take a look at the chats, okay?
Claire asked me to wear boxing gloves because my portion of the presentation is to describe what it's like to fight a case at the OMB or court, and in particular, how do you prepare for your advocacy to try and stop a development. By way of sort of introduction, I have been involved first at a firm called Gilbert's LLP, and now for the last 12 years at our own firm called Donnelly Law in over 200 cases involving everything from wetlands to renewable energy. We've fought quarries, we've dealt with First Nations cultural heritage, landscapes. Our firm is experienced in a broad range of different cases, including a number of cases around Lake Simcoe. My first recommendation to people who are preparing for advocacy, fighting a development, is to know your case law. And for most of you, that will probably involve looking back at old Ontario Municipal Board decisions. Many of them are quite poor in terms of their reasoning, they're dealing with issues, but there are a few ones that stand out in particular and are well worth reading, because lay people can educate themselves every bit as much as a lawyer can with respect to what are the planning precedents, not legal precedents per se, but the planning precedents at the OMB, or now the Local Planning Appeal Act Tribunal, or LPAT, that are still highly relevant. In my opinion, the best case there is to read with respect to natural heritage preservation and endangered species is the Burleigh Bay Corporation case. This was a case on the north shore of Stony Lake at Burleigh Falls, where there was a proposal to put 60 McMansions all along the shoreline in a very strange condominium complex that would affect the habitat of the Blandings turtle, a recently listed endangered species. The decision was rendered by a lawyer named David Lanche, and it's quite lengthy. It's, I think, 68 pages. But when you go through the sections dealing with natural heritage, endangered species, wetland preservation, the tests in the provincial policy statement that have to be met before a developer can get an approval, it stands out in my mind as being the clearest signal to environmentalists in terms of what kind of evidence you have to lead to be successful and how the board will deal with that evidence. So if I had sort of a call that probably gives me the most trouble is that people, citizens groups are very well intentioned, will call, they all have great aspirations for their case, but when they actually read the OMB decisions, if they are going to the OMB or now the LPAT, once they read those decisions, it can often be very dismaying in terms of, gee, it is a high bar to meet. You do have to have good evidence. You must have experts. So the first thing I would probably recommend is know your case. If it's a natural heritage case, I recommend reading the Burley Falls decision. We were legal counsel to the Friends of the Fraser Wetlands and the Curve Lake First Nations. But there are other cases certainly that you can reference, but I would start by reading the cases. If it's agricultural land preservation, Grandoni versus Club Italia from Niagara Falls, this was a proposal to pave 100 hectares of tender fruit land down on the outskirts of Niagara Falls. It was on the edge of the Greenbelt, on the edge of the Niagara Escarpment. And this is one where prime agricultural land preservation was venerated by the OMB as it then was, and we stopped the development. Again, our firm was legal counsel, but it will show you what evidence you need to lead in terms of trying to save prime agricultural land. So there are other cases that deal with density, intensification, cultural heritage, built heritage. There are two cases, recent cases from Kingston, the Homestead decision and the Innate Capital Theater decision, where heritage advocates in Kingston were successful in stopping two high-rise developments downtown. The one case, again by David Lanche, in the Innate Capital case, would be a guiding precedent for anyone concerned about overdevelopment and the preservation of built heritage. So my second recommendation with respect to tooling up to be a good advocacy group and preparing yourself for a legal challenge would be to know your experts. So I'm always amazed at what happens with citizens groups is they know there's a problem, the problem's developing, they're getting organized, they're getting together, and then a decision is on its way to municipal council. And then and only then do the groups call a lawyer. But that, in my opinion, is a huge mistake. If you're a member of a citizens group or you're just interested in protecting the environment, my advice to you is call some environmental lawyers now. Don't wait until you need one, because you've got to make a rush decision about who you like, who's experienced. You need to get to know the person. And that's probably a mistake when you're under the pressure of having to file something or organize your case or call some experts. Now, the good news is that if you're a citizens group, the people that you'll be calling, if you get the right list, will be extremely friendly. They will probably donate an hour of their time for free to do a consultation. You don't have to have a case that's imminent to talk to them, but you need to take a measure of their timber, so to speak. Now, there are a couple of lists floating around out there of environmental lawyers. For example, the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA, has a list of lawyers. The Gravel Watch has a list of lawyers. I'd be careful with those because I've vetted both of them recently, and they're very much out of date. They have a number of dead lawyers on the list, which isn't too helpful. The good news is that there aren't very many lawyers in the province who actually take on citizens groups, so you don't need to chase around the province ad nauseum. There's really only 3 or 4 lawyers that will actually represent citizens groups on a consistent basis. So, Jack Gibbons got very lucky with the Gwillimbury Forest case, and he got Leo Longo, who's a developer's lawyer, but an excellent lawyer. But that's the exception. Most lawyers will not represent citizens groups unless you're willing to pay the big bucks. So know your lawyer. Find your lawyer early. That will stand you in good stead. Similarly with planners, you cannot win a case at LPAT unless you have an experienced planner. You would be shocked at how few planners there are who've represented citizens groups and been successful at the OMB or LPAT. It's less than 10, and many of the ones that I have used previously or relied on as experts are now retiring. So it is critically important that you identify your planner early on in the piece, because if you wait to the last minute, they're probably either going to be busy or they don't like to be rushed. So again, it's a very short list, but familiarize yourself with who are the people that will work for citizens groups, because it's not a long list. Same advice for the rest of the disciplines: hydrogeology, agrology, traffic management, archaeology, all the things that you may be interested in terms of challenging development. Make sure that you are, if you've got something in mind and you think it might go to a dispute, whether it's 6 months, a year, 2 years out, start preparing your list of experts now, because it's very important that you familiarize yourself with who they are, what they cost, what their expertise is, have they been successful, and if so, how were they successful, or who is someone that might be a superior expert to the person to whom you've been referred. My third primary recommendation to citizens groups who are preparing for some kind of fight is to try and reduce your expectations for winning, but try and increase your expectations in terms of how much of a difference you can make. So anytime a citizen group goes to court or appears before LPAT, the odds are stacked against you. If you go and you have a municipality as your ally and they are going to present a complete case and you're more or less in the back seat watching, then you stand a reasonably good chance of success depending on the evidence. But if you're up against a developer and they have the municipality in support, then your chances are often extremely low in terms of succeeding. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't hire experts, hire a lawyer, and try and gather evidence. But at a certain point, you may realize that one, your case isn't going to be successful, or two, you may want to proceed with the case to sort of prove a point, or you've been told you have a 25% chance of winning, but you want to take the shot anyway. You may want to discipline the developer and the municipality for producing such a poor development application by dragging the process out for a year or two. That is a way to punish municipalities and punish developers. So as long as you're responsible for preparing your case, that's perfectly legitimate. But try and keep your expectations low in terms of winning at LPAT or court, but try and increase the possibility that you will be successful with some type of reform. And what I mean by that is when you're presented with an environmental challenge, don't see it as just your problem, see it as everyone's problem, and reach out to allied groups. So the classic example I use is Moon Point on the west shore of Lake Simcoe, up near Aurelia. There's a place called Moon Point. There was a proposal for, I think it was a 17-unit subdivision that would cut one of the two remaining significant interior forest habitats on the shoreline of Lake Simcoe. We were hired by the Moon Point Ratepayers Association to try and fight the development. And in the process of developing our case, we called Garfield Dunlop, who was then the MPP for the area, and he was so shocked by the development proposal, he agreed to testify at the OMB, which we were told was unprecedented at the time. He was so dismayed by the whole schmozzle of an OMB hearing to try and save this forest and how overmatched we were, that he asked for us for a recommendation about what should be done to prevent similar types of developments in the future. And then in collaboration with Claire Malcolmson and with Bobby Eisenberg, we came up with the idea of creating the Lake Simcoe Protection Act that would put a conservation plan through a regulation around the lake to prevent future shoreline developments, and it has been relatively successful. But that Lake Simcoe Protection Act movement started at Moon Point, which was a tiny little development fight over 17 units that led to one of North America's best watershed protection plans. So when you're scuffling with your own local case, try and reach out and make connections with people who maybe have a wider perspective or have a similar case, and see if that can't lead you to more reform bits. There are other examples like the Green Energy Act, for example. I wrote the first version of it with a woman named Marion Fraser. And that was a case where a wind turbine developer in the Ottawa Valley was being frustrated in terms of putting up wind turbines and solar panels because local people were saying, it's going to kill birds, it's going to affect wildlife. And finally, they were using archaeology as a reason to stop solar panels, when the solar panels would only be embedded a couple of inches into the ground. So that's when we turned that around. We wrote the Green Energy Act, and now Ontario was one of North America's leaders in terms of the development of renewable energy. So those are some examples where we lost in the initial instance, but we won the war in terms of making the province a better regulated environment. Last but not least, I would say reach out to First Nations. I know they're, they tend to be extremely busy and they don't want to hear about people when they're local problems by and large, but there are ways to reach out. Claire Malcolmson, for example, has excellent connections with First Nations in Simcoe County. So start early in trying to make connections with a First Nation because they can and often are an ally. For example, I just was informed today that in Prince Edward County, there was a major development proposal that was turned down primarily because Prince Edward County Council thought that the views of the Tyndall First Nation near Belleville were important and that their voice hadn't been heard. And so the Picton Terminals development application was denied this very day, in part because the local citizens had reached out to the Tyndall First Nation. And all they had done was made a very brief submission about they hadn't been consulted. They didn't think the development was appropriate. So that can work. Last but not least, if you're going to reach out to First Nations, make sure you know something about the history of the context in which you're dealing. So for example, and this will be am I almost out of time, Claire? Out of time? Or
Yeah, you're great. You've got two to 3 more minutes. Thank you.
Fantastic. Oh, great. I get to do something I love then. All right. Most of us on the line, I'm assuming, were born, raised, and educated in Ontario. Many of us probably were. How many people know what is the source of the name Washington, D.C.? Everybody knows it's General George Washington. Fair enough. How many people know the meaning of the word Ottawa? Almost no one. So it's important for us when reaching out to First Nations to say, well, look, we really care about a little forest. We really care about a little grove. We care about this part of the lake. If you don't know your history, who were the people that occupied the land at the time when the village was built? Who are the people who are in the burial? What is the movement of people? What is the respectful dialogue you have to have around the most culturally affiliated First Nations? These are all very important things to do before you reach out to the First Nation. Say, hey, would you like to be my ally in trying to stop this subdivision? So in conclusion, I'll give you the story of Ottawa. I apologize if there's 1 or 2 people out there who actually know the story, but I doubt it. When Champlain was organizing his military expedition to try and conquer the Mohawk in Upper New York State, he asked Etienne Brulé to scout through Ontario, to what we now think of as Ontario, and to rally the Huron-Wendat Nation to join him in the battle in Upper New York State. He told Etienne Brulé to paddle down the St. Lawrence River, to go up the what we now call the Ottawa River, and then to meet at a place called Toronto, which were the fishing weirs at Lake Couchiching. When Etienne Brulé, who had never been to Ottawa, reached the confluence or the divide between the Ottawa and the St. Lawrence River, he asked his guide, well, who are the people who live up this river? And the guide said, well, the people who live up this river are the people who control the trade on this river. He said, who are they? And the guide said, those are the Odawa people, which Etienne Brulé, when he reported back to Champlain, bastardized it and called them the Ottawa people. And that's how that location became known as Ottawa and the Ottawa River. Now, quickly to summarize, where do you think Ottawa County is and the headquarters of the Ottawa First Nation band headquarters, where do you think it is located? Why, Miami, Oklahoma, of course. The Odawa people were rounded up after the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. They made their way down the Ohio Territory, and then President Jackson rounded them up along with the Wyandot people, the Seneca, the Cayuga, 40 different First Nations where they were rounded up and marched down to what was called Indian Country or Oklahoma, where they were forcibly settled on reserves, which includes Seneca County, Ottawa County, and that's where the Odawa, the headquarters of that branch of the Odawa people are now in Oklahoma. So there's a very rich history here, which if you want to reach out to First Nations and ask them to become an ally, it behooves us to try and understand a little bit of their past. And if knowing that past, it often leads to a better dialogue. So my concluding remark would be this. Our firm has fought over 200 cases. We have by no means won even half of those cases. In fact, we've lost many, if not most of the cases. But for most of our clients, because we have invited them to invite in this notion that you fight the local battle, you act locally, but that you think provincially or nationally is the way we put it. So that when you're investing your time and energy in trying to stop your local, the local development or harm to the environment, you also can enliven yourself by recognizing that what you're doing is you're contributing to the overall greater good. You're trying to make a wider difference. And in fact, you're handing on a legacy to the next citizen group who's fighting a similar project. If you can get that important reform piece or change one counselor's mind through your case, you can actually do a lot more good than just fighting the individual case. So with that, Ms. Malcolmson, those are my submissions, subject to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, David. That was a really, really good rundown of excellent basic advice. And I hope that that was helpful for everybody on the call here. Again, please use the chat to pop in your questions. We're going to go right ahead to Jack now. And when Jack's finished, then we'll do a Q&A. So Jack Gibbons is the chair of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. Jack has worked on energy and environmental issues in Ontario for almost 40 years. His previous positions include economist at Energy Probe, project manager at Ontario Energy Board, senior economic advisor at the Canadian Institute for Environmental Law and Policy, and commissioner for Toronto Hydro. But you probably know Jack better through his incredible leadership and commitment, dogged determination to protect the North Gwillimbury Forest in Georgina through the North Gwillimbury Forest Alliance and Save Lake Simcoe. So with that, I will mute myself and welcome Jack to share his story with us.
Thanks, Claire. Can people hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so thanks for your kind introduction, and it's great to have the opportunity to talk with people today about our campaign to save the North Gwillimbury Forest. And to give some background, the North Gwillimbury Forest is located in the town of Georgina. It's on the southeast shore of Lake Simcoe, and it's one of the 10 largest forests in the Lake Simcoe watershed. In fact, it's more than 3 times the size of Vancouver Stanley Park. And so it's a priceless natural asset for the town of Georgina and for Lake Simcoe. And back in the early 1980s, a developer went before the Georgina Town Council and asked for permission to build the Maple Lake Estates, a subdivision on a wetland in the center of the North Gwillimbury Forest. And back in the early 1980s, there were no provincial or municipal policies against policies to protect wetlands. So the developer got the permission from town council to build this huge subdivision in the forest on a wetland. But then nothing happened, and then the developer went bankrupt. And so the property was put up for sale. And in 1999, the DG Group, which is a very big and politically powerful developer, bought the property. That was in 1999. And then in 2004, the Ministry of Natural Resources designated the Maple Lake Estates wetland as a provincially significant wetland. And so that was a huge step forward. And as a result, the town of Georgina was legally obliged to amend their official plan and their zoning bylaw to prohibit development on the Maple Lake Estates lands. But they didn't do so. They didn't do so. And then in 2011, we learned that the DG Group wanted to proceed with a Maple Lake Estates subdivision on this provincially significant wetland in the heart of the North Gwillimbury Forest. So we established the North Gwillimbury Forest Alliance to fight this proposal and to save the forest. And we had a 3-pronged strategy. The first prong was to build public support for our campaign. The second prong was to build political support. And the third prong was to hire an excellent lawyer, Leo Longo, and an excellent planning expert, Tony Usher, to provide us with professional advice for our campaign and to assist us if we needed to go to the local planning appeal tribunal to protect the forest. So that was our three-pronged strategy. The first prong was building public support, and that was relatively easy because virtually everyone in the town of Georgina loves the North Gwillimbury Forest. So to get their support for our campaign, all we had to do was inform them about this threat to the forest. And we did that. We developed, we got lots of email addresses so we could send email bulletins to our supporters whenever we needed to. We also produced pamphlets. We had petitions. We had lawn signs that blanketed the town. And we got good local media coverage. And we also got a very big story in the Toronto Star early on in our campaign. So our campaign, we got overwhelming public support for saving the forest very quickly. Now, the next prong was to build the political support on town council for them to actually take the actions needed to save the forest. And that was a much more difficult campaign. So the first thing we did is we went to town council and we said, please amend your official plan and your zoning bylaw to prohibit development on the Maple Lake Estates wetlands. And they absolutely refused to do so, absolutely refused to do so. So then the 2014 municipal election came around, and we took that opportunity to ask the voters in the town of Georgina to elect a new council, a council that would actually protect all the wetlands in the town of Georgina, including the wetlands in the North Gwillimbury Forest. And that campaign was very successful. We elected a new mayor and we elected virtually a completely new council. The mayor and most of the councillors promised that they would amend the official plan and the zoning bylaws to protect all the wetlands in the town of Georgina. So on election night in 2014, we thought we'd won. But here's what actually happened. The new council did pass a new official plan. They passed a new official plan. And that new official plan prohibited development on every single wetland in the town of Georgina with one exception. That one exception was the Maple Lake Estates lands. The new official plan continued to allow Maple Lake Estates to build a 1,073 unit subdivision on a provincially significant wetland in the heart of the North Gwillimbury Forest. And on council, there was only one councillor, Dave Nissan, who was elected in 2014 on a promise to save the forest. He was the only councillor who objected to this official plan. He was the only councillor who said, this is not right. You've got to pass an official plan that will also prohibit development on the Maple Lake Estates lands. But unfortunately, he was in the minority back then. And so this new official plan was approved, which continued to allow development on the Maple Lake Estates lands. So we had to appeal this official plan to the local planning appeal tribunal. And we had our hearing, we had our LPAT hearing in May 2018. And at that hearing, we were not just fighting the DG group, the developer, but we were also fighting the town of Georgina and the regional municipality of York. Both the town and the region used our taxpayers' dollars to argue that the DG group should be allowed to destroy this provincially significant wetland and split the North Gwillimbury Forest in two. I mean, it was absolutely outrageous. And the town, for example, spent $71,000 of taxpayers' dollars to fight us. So it was us against the DG group and the town and the region of York. But the good news is we totally beat them. The LPAT issued their decision in December 2019, and they amended the official plan. They amended the official plan by designating more than 99% of the Maple Lake Estates lands as an environmental protection area. A huge victory. more than 99% of this 500-acre property they designated as an environmental protection area. And when that decision came down in December 2019, then the town of Georgina, thanks to all Dave Nison's great advocacy since he was elected in 2014, in December 2019, the town of Georgina finally switched sides and decided to support the North Gwillimbury Forest Alliance and the forest, and no longer promote the interests of the DG group. So the town announced that they would now go forward and rescind the old Maple Lake Estates zoning bylaw and put in a new one that would prohibit development on more than 99% of the Maple Lake Estates lands. So that was a huge reversal. It was a huge victory. The town was now working with us, was now on our side. Needless to say, the DG group was not pleased that the town had abandoned them. And so they wrote to the LPAT and they asked for a review of the LPAT's decision. Well, the LPAT gave the DG group their response in May of this year. And they just flatly rejected the DG group's request for a review. They said their decision was correct, that the North Gwillimbury Forest wetlands should be protected. So that was in May of this year. But still, the DG group wasn't willing to give up. They were not willing to give up. They still wanted to have the right to destroy the wetland and the forest. So what did they do? Well, on June the 11th, they secretly submitted an application to the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority for a new permit, a new Conservation Authority permit to allow them to destroy the provincially significant wetland. They submitted that application on June the 11th in secret. We were not informed. In June the 18th, 7 days later, with no public consultation, the Conservation Authority gave them a new Section 28 permit, Conservation Authority permission to destroy this provincially significant wetland. I mean, this was totally immoral, totally wrong. The Conservation Authority is supposed to protect wetlands, not facilitate their destruction. And it was also completely illegal. So we sent the Conservation Authority a letter saying, look, your permit is illegal. Please rescind it. And we put them on notice. If necessary, we will go to the divisional court and seek a judicial review to get the courts to rule that your illegal permit is illegal. So that's what we did. And then Dave Nison, our great ally on town council, he brought forward a motion before council to ask that the town of Georgina to also ask the Conservation Authority to rescind their permit and to also put the Conservation Authority on notice that the town would consider taking legal action if necessary by going to the courts to protect the forest. And as a result of our actions and the strong leadership of Councillor Dave Nison, the DG group finally threw in the towel. They finally gave up. Just 2 or 3 hours before Councillor Nison's motion was to go before council for a vote, the DG group announced that they were surrendering their wetland destruction permit. They just surrendered it. They gave up. And so that was fantastic news. So that was in August of this year. So 9 years after we launched the campaign, we won. The DG group no longer has a wetland destruction permit, and town council has promised that they will put the final nail in the coffin for the Maple Lake Estates subdivision by amending the zoning bylaw to prohibit development on more than 99% of the Maple Lake Estates lands. So in summary, we won this campaign after 9 years by implementing our strategy. We built public support. With Councillor Nison's help, we built political support, And we finally got the town council to work to save the forest and to change the bylaws to save the forest. And we did this with the help of our great lawyer and our great planning consultant. And so that was our three-pronged strategy. We implemented it. And actually, now that I think of it, there was also a fourth prong to our strategy, and that was persistence. We had to keep at this campaign for 9 years to win it. So thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I'm seeing comments, just what an incredible story, what persistence. Thank you. So I'm going to start with a question that is related to this case exactly, and then I will go to a couple questions we've got by email. Alejandra Kaye asks, for Jack Gibbons, when they submitted the request in secret, how were you informed, or who was monitoring that process? I assume that relates to the Section 28 permit.
Absolutely. Yes, so it was very lucky that for a number of years now, we've been watching the Conservation Authority very closely. And to do that, we've had to issue a Freedom of Information request. And our Freedom of Information request requires the Conservation Authority to report to us every month on all their correspondence with respect to the Maple Lake Estates development. So a couple of weeks after that permit was illegally issued, we learned about it thanks to our Freedom of Information request.
Okay, thank you. All right, so folks, please put any questions you have in the chat, and if we'll see how that goes, and if we have to do it another way, we will. But I have a couple questions lined up. This is from George, the president of the Henderson Forest Aurora Ratepayer Association. Thank you very much, George, for joining us and for asking a question. This question is for David. David Donnelly, when a case is scheduled to appear before LPAT and it is being defended by a municipality's outside legal counsel, can counsel involve itself when the town's case is not, in the opinion of the public, having access to LPAT submissions, being prepared adequately?
The answer is, of course, municipality who hires external legal counsel is very much the client, just as if a citizens group hires a lawyer and the case is heading in a direction that the client doesn't like. So the problem that I have encountered over the years is that quite often municipal counselors, like most people, tend to be relatively inexperienced when it comes to going to court or running a case all the way through the Ontario Municipal Board or LPAT. And so as a result, they tend to sort of hand the case off to the lawyer and say, you run it, bring back a result. The problem is that many citizens become active in the case and want access to reports, access to the experts. They basically want to know how the case is being developed because, of course, you're paying for it. But most lawyers who represent municipalities tend to, in their practice, represent developers most often and occasionally municipalities, which means that their inclination is to see development as a compromise. Most municipal lawyers, in my experience, don't see development as an all or nothing proposition. It's most often what's the compromise that's available here. So you see it from time to time that a mayor or a council who is familiar with the OMB, they've been through a number of cases, they will become quite proactive in managing files, and they will be very demanding in terms of summonsing the lawyer, summonsing the planner to council and asking for case updates. That's usually the best way to sort of get what you want. But most municipalities, in my experience, they hand the case off to the lawyer disappears, you get your decision at the end of the day, and people say, well, why did you do that? Why did you do that? Why did you do that? Well, you know, we trusted our lawyer. So I'm familiar now with a couple of municipalities who are changing direction and insisting that the lawyer reports to them at every step in the process. And that's perfectly legitimate.
All right. Thanks, David. A follow-up question, a little bit more detailed on the same topic. Same group, I gather. So question number 2 for you, David. The following is being argued with regard to the phrase "not adversely affect the ecological integrity of the plan area," and in support of removing an area of significant woodland, significant valley land, and endangered, rare, and threatened species habitat. And I'm quoting, "This could only be reasonably interpreted to mean the ecological integrity of the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan area, a vast area for which a proposed development would need to be removing a very important and extensive feature, for example, a landscape level linkage feature, to have an impact on that scale. On that basis, the removal of a small portion of an urban woodlot would not be considered to be affecting the ecological integrity of the plan area on its own merits," end quote. Do you agree that the measurement should be the adverse effects on the natural heritage systems themselves, given that the health of the moraine depends on the sum of its parts?
Right, so this is a part and parcel of the net gain movement or argument that's been occurring in the province for the last 20 years. So about 20 years ago, there was amongst ecological planners and some biologists this notion that if you were to remove a part of a natural heritage system but replace it elsewhere with, say, planting trees, for example, that would represent a net gain, and in fact the natural heritage system or feature would be enhanced. Probably the best or worst example of that argument would be in the MAQ aggregates decision up in Grey County. We represented the Grey Matters group, and this was a proposal for about 100-hectare quarry where they're going to remove significant woodland and plant it many miles away, which obviously couldn't protect or enhance the local environmental feature. So in the context of the Oak Ridges Moraine, I think it's bizarre that you would make that claim, but you've got to have someone with experience, like a biologist or ecologist like Gord Miller, for example, who can come in and dispute that the loss of a small portion of a feature, in fact, creates an adverse impact. So in the PPS, the test is no negative impact. And again, it comes down to the opinion of a biologist about whether removing a small piece of a feature creates that negative impact. And again, to me, the best discussion of that in terms of an OMB decision context would be the Burley Falls case. I think that's an excellent example of an OMB member tackling the problem and actually explaining it, which in that case, there was a rejection of this idea that removing small parts of the Fraser wetlands features would impair the overall health of the ecosystem.
Right, thank you. Often depends on who is sitting in what chairs, right? How this is all interpreted and how it goes. Thanks, David. Okay, back to Jack for a couple of shorter questions. Don't answer what you don't want to answer, Jack, but a lot of praise, thank you. Kevin Thompson from SOS Beaverton asks, does the 1% of the forest not protected represent some grandfathered development?
No, the LPAT was aiming to protect all the wetlands and all the significant woodlands, and as a result of their ruling, that's more than 99% of the total property. So there's just a very small little piece of land where they're presently growing corn that are not protected.
Okay. And a second question, Jack, how did the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority explain their action on illegally permitting the destruction?
Well, they didn't. Well, actually, they did it twice. They gave the permit first in 2018, and then they illegally renewed it in 2020 in June. So when the first time they did it, they claimed because the DG group had a registered plan of subdivision that trumped all the environmental laws in Ontario, and therefore they had no choice but to issue a permit. And that was just absolutely fallacious. our lawyer Leo Longo gave many legal submissions, explained to them why that wasn't the case. But nevertheless, they were bound and determined to give DG Group a permit. And then when they did it again in June, we again wrote to them, explained why it was illegal. And as I noted, as a result of this time threatening to go to the courts, the DG Group threw in the towel and gave up, surrendered the permit. And we wrote to the Conservation Authority and we said, okay, we've explained to you why that permit was illegal for so many reasons. Can you please give us a detailed reply and tell us whether you disagree with anything we've said in our legal submissions? And they refused to do so. We went to the Conservation Authority and made an oral deputation requesting them to do so, but they refused to do so. They absolutely refused to do so.
So much for transparency. Another question, someone's asking, what was the final price tag on this fight?
Well, it was huge. I mean, this campaign went on for 9 years, and I've, highlighted, some of the battles we were involved in, but there was much more than I just alluded to in a few minutes ago. We had countless submissions to the town, to the region of York, to the Conservation Authority, to the province. And so it was a huge cost. I mean, our LPAT hearing alone cost us about $100,000. And the total cost of winning this battle over 9 years was about $500,000.
That is not fair. And again, massive thanks for your determination. I'll put this question to you, Jack, and then go back to David. Question from Michelle. How does a citizen go about requesting or proposing to a city that they amend their official plan, for example, to designate land as environmentally protected as EP?
Well, we just wrote to them. We wrote to the town and we made the request. We had a detailed submission from our planning expert, Tony Usher, explaining why our proposal was consistent with good planning and the law. So we submitted the submission in writing, and then we also made oral deputations to town council in support of our submission.
In that case, there had already been detailed studies that were in the town's possession about the subject lands, right? So in your case, you could do that. I wonder, if you don't answer this, if you can, and if not, we'll put it over to David, where there's private land that somebody wants to develop, but has not yet gone through those studies. Do citizens have any opportunities to recommend and to get the studies done on the land in order to get it designated as EP? Or is that just resulting from an initiation of a development permit application?
Well, maybe David better answer this.
Okay. Did you get that question, David?
Yeah. No, I'm afraid I got lost, but that happens very often at my advanced age.
Because you're so grizzled. So the question, I'm just trying to poke a little bit more where there are lands that are not designated EP that maybe should be. If it's privately owned land and there haven't been studies initiated resulting from planning application, do citizens have any recourse in terms of flagging and identifying and getting lands protected?
Yes. So the Planning Act has a very seldom used but incredibly important instrument called the Interim Control Bylaw, ICBL, section 39 or something or other of the Planning Act. Anyway, the point is that a majority of council can pass a bylaw that freezes all development or zoning or changes to zoning on a particular property. Now, with that ICBL commitment, the township has to undertake a study or studies that will reveal solutions to a problem or will present an alternative form of land use or ultimately a change in zoning to the land. So in the case of, let's say that there is a parcel where it's clearly a PSW, it's clearly significant interior forest habitat, people think that there may be a development application coming and the zoning isn't proactive. If you can get a majority of council to pass an ICBL, that does two things. It freezes all development applications for the period of 1 year with the possibility of an extension to 2 years. Plus it commits council to doing it, for example, an ecological study, a hydrogeology study. And if the recommendations of that study come back saying it is a PSW, it is a significant interior forest habitat, it should be protected, then council can act on that without repercussion and pass what I call proactive zoning or protection zoning without having to wait for an official plan review, which sometimes takes years or decades to come.
Great. Great little tool not everybody knows about. Thank you, David. Next question for you from Janice. David, have you ever encountered organized illegal behaviors on the part of proponents, like obstruction, using municipal and elected officials, paying planners, integrity commissioners, municipal lawyers, and experts to act in the best interests of the proponent? Maybe not all of them at the same time, but you understand the question.
Yeah. Well, I have never encountered, I've never been able to discover developers paying off counselors. Let's put it that way. I've always had my suspicions. In terms of experts, I have never been suspicious that a developer had, quote unquote, paid a consultant to torque or distort their opinion evidence. However, there are a number of experts, in my opinion, who are so wedded or addicted to development retainers that I don't think we're getting a fair shake with respect to their ecological evidence. So for example, in the case of the Friends of Grand Trunk Ravine on the Oak Ridges Moraine, there's a proposal to put 32 houses in the Grand Trunk Ravine. The city of Vaughan, the TRCA flip-flopped 1 week before the hearing was to commence and went from opposing the development to supporting it. We won at the Ontario Municipal Board, and they said that there had to be an ecological corridor connecting the McMillan estate to the Patterson Forest, a regionally significant woodland, and that the TRCA was to decide how wide that wildlife corridor was to be to connect the two forests. We had on retainer Gord Miller, and he went through all the science on wildlife corridors, how robust they need to be, how wide. And because that there were deer, coyote, wild turkey using this corridor, it had to be fairly robust. It couldn't be 5 or 10 meters. And his recommendation, it should be a minimum of 60 meters. The biologist, or some people laughingly refer to them as the biostitute, for the developer recommended a 10-meter buffer widening out in one section to 22 meters and then shrinking back down to a 10-meter buffer. There is no justification for that, no science for that. It is absolutely absurd to make that kind of recommendation. The city of Vaughan and the TRCA both embraced that 10 to 22 meter buffer. That was submitted to the Ontario Municipal Board, and the Ontario Municipal Board ruled in the TRCA and the developer's favor. That is an example of a so-called biologist making a recommendation that I don't feel is principled. I'm doing another case up in Vaughan where there's a proposal to convert a part of the Copper Creek golf course into a subdivision. This is part of the East Humber River, part of the properties in the Greenbelt. The proposal there is to create a massive stormwater management pond in the Greenbelt, which will service the development, which is clearly not, there's red side dace habitat at the outfall where the stormwater management pond is. Now, setting that aside, in this particular case, the planner for the developer wrote a letter of reference to what we call the Commissioner of Planning for the City of Vaughan, recommending him for a promotion, saying that they shared the same belief that there was too much protectionism going on in the City of Vaughan around the Greenbelt. And yet these two were happily walking down the aisle to our LPAT hearing, which is going to happen in November. Now, happily, the Commissioner of Planning is no longer with the city of Vaughan. However, it still stands that we obtained through Freedom of Information, this letter of reference. So yes, I don't think it's always as blatant as a payoff, but yes, there is undue influence exerted on experts in some planning cases.
Thank you very much. We're at the end of our scheduled time, so I would like to say thanks so much again to a couple of my real heroes, Jack and David. Always a pleasure to see you and your boxing gloves and your incredible tenacity. Also, I didn't mention that David is a really good oyster shucker, and I know that that's a very important part of his identity and his life outside of being an excellent environmental lawyer. So on that silly note, I'd just like to say thanks everybody again for being with us today. We are going to end the meeting, and if you want to ask any other questions, we may be able to get some more answered. You can email, I'll put the email address in the chat right now, rescuelakesimcoecoalition@gmail.com. Thanks everybody, and have a great afternoon.